Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
The Soviet military that went into Afghanistan was formulated around fighting a European war. They were not prepared in any form or fashion to fight what became a guerrilla war immediately.
In this episode, historian and writer Michael G. Stroud explores how decades of political instability drew the Soviet Union into Afghanistan in 1979, and why the intervention quickly spiraled into a protracted and unwinnable war. From the struggle to control vast, rugged terrain to the challenge of winning support from a fiercely independent population, we examine the realities faced by Soviet and Afghan government forces. At the centre of the discussion are the battles for Zhawar, a vast cave complex on the Afghan-Pakistan border that served as a critical Mujahideen stronghold. Through two major assaults, we uncover how guerrilla tactics, terrain and resilience repeatedly frustrated a technologically superior force. I'm delighted to welcome Michael G. Stroud to our Cold War conversation. A good place for us to start is, why are the Soviets in Afghanistan? Why do they invade in 1979?
Like so many things, history tends to be a domino effect, right? One thing will lead to another. And really, we can trace this back to 1973, if not before that. Technically 1955, which is when Moscow really started providing military training to Afghan military forces. So really 1955, but we really see it come to a forefront in 73 when Mohammed Daoud, who was a former Afghan prime minister, instituted a coup against the King Zahir of Afghanistan. And that really was the first, I would say, domino to fall that would lead to a succession of usurpers, people assassinating their predecessors, assuming power. And it just would lead to a confluence of events, which would lead to Hafizullah Amin becoming general secretary in 1979, which is really kind of long story short, as it were, to kind of lay the foundations of how the Soviets really had interest and, let's say, had their fingers in the pie, as it were, in Afghanistan for both as a Soviet Union, but even further before that when they were the Russian Empire. So without kind of covering the whole history of Afghanistan and invasion, the Russian Empire had its hands in Afghanistan as well for some time, fighting various insurgencies against various powers there. So they've been knocking on that door for quite a while.
I think I've heard Afghanistan described as the graveyard of empires. Is that correct?
Yes, and I believe that phrase was coined around 2001, if I remember correctly. And there's a lot of validity to that general statement. You can go through every period of history, and some power of some sort has thought to impose its will or control over the Afghan general geographic area. And ultimately, we know how that pans out. It doesn't end so well for any of those empires or powers. What's really interesting is even Winston Churchill in his youth wrote specifically about Afghanistan around 1897. And there's a quote that's really of his that I'd like to share because I think it's very important to the context of Afghanistan as a whole. And this is again from 1897, where he says, quote, "A continual state of feud and strife prevails throughout the land. Tribe wars with tribe. The people of one valley fight with those of the next. To the quarrels of communities are added the combats of individuals. Every man's hand is against the other and all against the stranger," end quote. And I think that last part, "and all against the stranger," really is the perfect lead-in to what happens in Afghanistan for the Soviet Union and their modern army.
Indeed. Hafizullah Amin is in power in 1979. Is he a communist, Michael, or is he a proxy that's being supported by the Soviet Union?
Yeah, interesting, because I think he's more of an opportunist personally. I think really what it comes out. Now, obviously, he needs the support of the strength the Soviet Union can bring, but it becomes obvious to the powers that be in Moscow that he is not the one to carry out their will correctly. He's lost the support of the majority of the country at this point. The rural uprising that came about really took away about 2/3 of the country from his direct control. The Afghan army, which was at one point around 100,000 troops, really by this point was so decimated through desertion and internal battles and strife that it could barely hold on to Kabul and a few other spots. So really it became obvious to the Soviets that they're going to have to take a direct intervention or his entire administration is going to collapse and it's not going to work out for him. So really he just became extremely ineffective by not being able to win the will of the people there. And that's really always the key, right? Is the will of the people ultimately determine the success of any kind of government or occupying force even. And we've seen that time and time again, and he absolutely experienced that.
And the Soviets have decided this isn't purely going to be an intervention. They want to get rid of the guy.
Yes.
So can you describe the events of December 1979 and the Soviet invasion, and particularly what happens around Amin?
Absolutely. So, as I had alluded to already, Amin was really proven to be wholly ineffective in his role. So the Soviets had already had about 1,500 military advisors on the ground, but they also had around 8,000 troops as well. With those, they were very aware that this guy's failing in every capacity for their ends to a means. So they had already been amassing more troops on the border for that, basically to get that call, right, to make their way in full force, which that really came about around Christmas Eve, Christmas Day of 1979, when direct Soviet intervention was determined. We have to go in now. We need a full strength effort because this guy is falling very short of what we need him to do. So that's when we saw the 40th Army and support air units crossing Afghanistan around Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. Several days later, 4 divisions would land at Afghan airports to bolster that immediately. Obviously, Kabul being the capital was their first main target. But at this point, loyal troops to Amin didn't like the fact that he was going to be removed for not doing his job as Moscow saw fit. So his forces engaged in heavy, basically city block-to-block fighting with Soviet troops, coming to a head at Tashberg Palace, which is where Soviet troops are able to push in, defeat his guards, his loyal men, and Amin was executed as well as all of his male family members and any of those inner circle guys, the ones that were the hardcore supporters of Amin. So Moscow removed their deficient player, as it were, and then they instituted and put into place Babrak Karmal as their new general secretary at that point.
And did Kamal change things? Was he directly under Soviet control?
With Karmal, he was very much a Soviet puppet. What's interesting is there's very much this feeling within, I would say, a wide berth of Afghans throughout the country that Amin was not well liked, but he was at least Afghan. He was their kind of leader, as it were. Karmal was basically handpicked and placed on the seat of power by an outside force. If we remember just that quote from Winston Churchill about every man's hand is against the other and all against the stranger. Well, already that placement of what was considered basically an outsider, the Soviets, placing this other guy in the seat of power to try to rule over all Afghans, that went over very poorly immediately. So that just inflamed the sentiments to cause an even stronger uprising and a military pushback, especially against the rural outlying locations of Afghanistan outside of the cities. That's what it really became obvious. Sir Karmal, and it panicked him. He was freaking out early. He's like, I can't control this. These people are against me. I need more support, more Soviet assistance. So that just gave the Soviets the okay to start flooding in massive, quote unquote, modern military resources to shore up his power base, because his power base existed through Soviet arms and direct military support. He didn't have it otherwise. So we would see over 100,000 Soviet troops make their way in relatively short order once he pulled the panic button that it was obvious he would not be able to hold on to that power without their direct help.
And with those troops, do they successfully take control of the country or not? I think I know the answer to this, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Afghanistan has always been plagued by its wide stretch of geography, right? It's over 652,000 square kilometers, which for my U.S. friends, that's basically roughly the size of Texas, our state of Texas. So it's a good chunk of geography. But when you throw into there the ruralness of it, the mountain ranges, which can have peaks as high as 20,000 feet, and then you have deserts, and you only have little spatches or spotches of arable land, that really forces the cities in certain locations. The Soviets by no means had enough men to pacify that entire country with that kind of dispersed landmass. So what they do? They concentrated on Kabul, and they concentrated on the major cities that did exist. It's much easier, as the Soviets found out, and so did America, to be frankly honest, that you can win a fight of the major cities fairly quickly, but it's pacifying and changing the hearts and minds of those beyond those cities that proved difficult at best. And the Soviets really only could exercise direct control over those major cities that became their power bases, where their armor, where their weapons depots, where they had direct influence. So like Kabul and Herat and those others, that's where they had the direct control. You go outside of the city much, it's game on. It's the freedom fighters, the Mujahideen, that rose up against this intervention that really held sway and would use that to their advantage year after year to exact revenge against the Soviets and the government forces at the time.
I remember Jimmy Carter being on TV announcing the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. How soon did the Americans sort of start to actively try and support the Mujahideen?
The Carter administration was really torn internally about what courses of action to take. And there was those that pushed we should start arming these insurgents immediately to push back against Soviet aggression, while others said, let's do non-lethal support and see what happens. So really early on, they started sending non-lethal support initially. Very much what had happened in other events in more contemporary times from the United States. A good case in point would be Ukraine, initially non-lethal, and then it switched over. That's very much what the Carter administration early on was really began to send non-lethal support pretty early on to the fighters, and they would send it in through Pakistan. Pakistani intelligence would help to filter it into the country itself. And that happened within, I would say, months that would begin to flow into there.
The main focus of our conversation today is going to be around Zhawar and its importance to both the Mujahideen and the Afghan government. Can you tell me, why did it become such an important location in this war?
Sure. So to really set a little bit of a context, early on the Mujahideen established throughout greater Afghanistan a network of different bases using the natural terrain, the many caves, the hundreds if not thousands of caves within the mountain ranges and networks that were around the country itself. Zhawar really became one of the more contentious and critical ones from a strategic point of view, but also the tactical springboard that it served for Mujahideen. But on the other end, it proved to be a huge thorn in the saddle for the government of Afghanistan and Soviet forces. So Zhawar was on the central eastern border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and was really close to being a major supply hub of Miran Shah, which is in Pakistan. This mountain complex, as it were, was really a series of 41 caves linked by 11 tunnels that ran about 500 yards underground. what was amazing about this is Zhawar as a whole included things like a hotel, which ironically was where the international press would come to stay to report on events. So that became basically Hotel Afghanistan in many ways for the West, especially. It had a mosque, weapons depot, medical stations. It was a radio hub for that part of the country itself. But it also was where they housed 2 captured Soviet T-55 tanks, which will come into play very much during the battles of Zhawar itself. So it was a major critical hub, especially in this part of the country where attacks were staged out of repeatedly. And it was led by a gentleman named Jalaluddin Haqqani, who was proved to be a very effective Mujahideen leader against the government forces and Soviets as well. So Zhawar is really indicative of the type of network that the Mujahideen built and used extensively throughout the duration of the war itself, and proved to be very effective at what it did. It used natural terrain to their benefit. It hampered the efforts of the government and the Soviets to track them down, let alone take the facility itself, which we'll get into, obviously. So it really served a lot of points. And plus, it was natural. You didn't need billions of dollars in order to do that. They would blast it out and then make the best of what they had to fight back against what was considered a superior military with Soviet equipment and armaments.
So the Afghan government decide they've had enough of this thorn in their side and they want to try and take it. So what is their plan? And how does it fare?
We're looking at about September 1985 at this point. The idea behind this is that this spearhead of this assault on Zhawar is going to be led by Karmal's governmental forces predominantly. The first assault is to show how well armed they are, how they're the legitimate power of the country. So they're going to lead this attack. Now, it's an interesting thing because already at the beginning, just to pull together enough governmental troops, they're cannibalizing others. So we see elements of the 37, 38 commando brigades being pulled together. They're massing out of the Coast Gardes area, 25th Infantry Division. So they pull together artillery and infantry predominantly. Now, to pause here, this timing of this attack is important because at this time, the top commanders of Zhawar are not even there. They're on Hajj or pilgrimage to Mecca. So Haqqani and his top commanders are not even present, which is interesting because really becomes an intelligence failure on 2 parts here. And that this is important because this plagues both sides. An intelligence failure on the governmental side, the Afghan government, because of the placement of what is there, but also an intelligence failure on Haqqani's side for even knowing an attack is being planned. So we have failures on both ends here, and things work out at least to some extent for each side, pros and cons both. So it's just kind of a prelude to what's coming. So the government pulls together its commando brigades, its 25th Infantry Division at Coast, and they basically create a column. Composite forces, as I said, pulled it together. And it's under the command of Lieutenant General Shahnawaz Tani. He has artillery support and targeted airstrikes, which becomes a common theme, especially at this point in the war. So they launch their attack. Early on, and this is critical, early on, the Mujahideen are great at using blocking forces, small groups of men to halt a larger force. And they've done this early on. They deployed an 80-man blocking force on the eastern slopes of what's called the Mughal Gar, and the kind of eastern perimeter of what Zhawar is. This allows them to always buy time, slow down a greater force. So what's interesting is the DRA, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan forces, the government troops, decide that they're going to attack the base under cover of darkness. But not being aware of this blocking force, they arrive in the dark and boom, they're met by fire immediately, which, to add insult to injury, they were relying on their armored personnel and their other trucks, thinking we're just going to overwhelm these Mujahideen. They lose 2 armored personnel carriers and 4 trucks immediately in that first engagement, right as they to begin the assault. Well, that's already a bad juju, as we would say, for the attackers, because that really destroys what little bit of esprit de corps those DRA troops had. So they began to immediately withdraw back to coast, which allowed the Mujahideen to reassert control over the area immediately. So with that pushback, the DRA then, okay, let's target a different town. It's called Lezai. I'm not quite sure on the pronouncement of that as well. Lezhi. So please forgive me if that's wrong as well. That was a little more successful. They killed that Mujahideen commander there, and we're talking around September 4th. Now, that's an important date because that's when Haqqani and the others that were away in Hajj return and realize, okay, we're under an attack here. Let me reassume control. So what does he do? He orders the Mujahideen to withdraw from that city of Lezhi south. And then he uses, again, 20 more Mujahideen to block the pass. Now, I want to pause here because to kind of set the foundation for some of that geography. Because I mentioned this earlier, that the Mujahideen especially were really wily at using the topographical benefits of Afghanistan to their benefit to help them out significantly. So this area, Manai Kandal, was a natural fortified position. It had high peaks, thick rock slab caps, and it could shelter dozens of troops from airstrikes and shelling, which is really important. To add to this, the Mujahideen weren't just sitting on their laurels for what was naturally there. They added to it. So they dug defenses and communication trenches that also allowed them to see that the plain below them, which is where the DRA would try to attack from. So this played into their benefit a lot when the DRA launched infantry attacks against open field right at them. I think any basic student of military history will know it usually ends poorly when you attack across an open field against a fortified position. And here, it didn't end well for them as well. They were turned back, heavy small arms fire, made no progress against the Mujahideen that were set up against their fortifications and entrenchments. Airstrikes, artillery barrages, that would continue. And same with these infantry attacks for 10 days. So the Mujahideen were dug in basically in the elevated position, entrenched, natural, hard surroundings. But 10 days of bombing and air attacks from the DRA wasn't enough. So they called in for Russian heavier airstrikes, heavier bombers. So that they started to pound and pound. Eventually, that war on the psyche of the Mujahideen, though, at this first battle of Zhawar, because they felt that there's a chance with this heavier bombardment by the Soviet aircraft now that maybe it could collapse the cave in on them. So they pulled out around September 14th, which did allow the DRA to move in finally and occupy that high ground. So it was a tactical gain for them at this point. As they were pulling out, the Mujahideen, they had a rear guard action, obviously, to protect so they could cross over and get away from that attack. But what was interesting is during this gaining of the territory that was left vacant by the Mujahideen, they started to coalesce, the DRA did, on the high grounds on these slopes. And they thought, let's just gather all of our troops, let's mass our resources. So they've pushed into the caves. They took some of that defended territory. So they're thinking, let's mass together for a final push and end this thing. What's interesting is right at this point where they're massed on this exposed territory with all their mechanized APCs and things, that's right when, to their surprise, the Mujahideen decide to come out to meet them with their T-55 captured Soviet tanks, which intelligence failure on the DRA's part and the Soviets' part, who either weren't aware or didn't inform them of this, really did a number on them. These two tanks came out and just started laying waste to their gathered, grouped, and clumped DRA troops. That was the back-breaking point of that. So because these tanks just scattered through bodies everywhere, were destroying the armor they did have, the light armor, and it just basically mowed down and destroyed the DRA initiative at that point, where basically they were just full on in full retreat, trying to get away from those tanks, from those cannons that were just blowing holes in their formations. So all told, we're talking about 42 days from beginning to end of that first Battle of Zhawar. And really the saving grace was the sudden appearance of those T-55s, as well as the fallacy for the DRA to group themselves in a clustered position that was still fairly exposed and allowing those tanks to do the damage that they were able to do. So surprise played on the side of the Mujahideen to basically drive them back out by pulling out those old tanks that did the job.
And what sort of casualties do the DRA suffer in this battle?
This has been a constant problem, even though it's contemporary history. The exact numbers are unknown, but the best I've been able to find in any resources is just that they were heavy losses as a whole. Now, the Mujahideen had somewhere around this first battle around 500 troops present. They lost over 100, so about 100, 106 killed, roughly 300 plus wounded in the battle itself. But we don't have accurate records still as to the actual casualty numbers for the DRA at this point, after the 42 days of fighting.
And it sounds like the DRA's morale was pretty fragile before this started. This can't have helped it much.
No, that just really just caps it more. And it just shows the ineffectiveness of the guy, Karmal, who's in charge. It's showing that he's only as strong as the support he's getting from the Soviets. His own troops can't stand up to fight against his own people. So that just really is psychologically another break in that whole facade that he's tried to put on by this attack against the key Mujahideen base. And so that becomes obvious that he can't handle it. He's not up to the task, as it were.
And did the Mujahideen have any anti-aircraft firepower at this point?
At this point, they do not, but that's going to change roughly around 1986. 1986 is an important year because that's when we start to see the influx of lethal aid at the form of Stinger missiles by the United States start to make their way through the CIA, through Pakistani intelligence, and through Pakistan itself. It begin to make their way there. For those of you of a certain age, which would be a lot of us, you can get a feel for that from Rambo 3, the movie Rambo 3, where Colonel Trotman was on the ground in Afghanistan, was talking about Stinger missiles, and the Soviet commander of his regions espousing his vehement hatred for Stinger missiles, how it's affecting Soviet aircraft. That's very much what would play out in the real world as they begin to make their way in the Mujahideen hands. We would see a greater toll on Soviet aircraft, especially Soviet attack helicopters, get taken down by these Stinger missiles. So that would play a big role in beginning to negate some of that Soviet air power.
So the second attempt to take Zhawar is in February, April 1986. Are the Soviets taking a greater hand in this attack, or are they still leaving it to the Afghan commanders to come up with a battle plan?
The Soviets are going to take a much greater role in this and breaking this down. They're requiring a much stronger commitment of troops from the DRA, but they're also going to have 2,000 direct troops, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 191st Motorized Rifle Regiment. And this time, the Soviet troops are going to be led by Lieutenant General Nabi Azimi, with Soviet Major General Trefremenko serving as combat advisor. So the idea is, okay, we gave the DRA their chance wholly by themselves. We need to have direct Soviet troops and Soviet leadership present to see if we can guide this to a success at this time. Now, the DRA, as I said, was coalescing a much bigger force yet. So they committed to 54 battalions, keeping in mind these are all under strength, but still 54 battalions on paper, artillery, air support. We would see things like the 7th, 8th, 14th, and 25th Infantry Divisions, 38th Commando Brigade, Air Assault Regiment. So they had almost 12,000 troops with tasking to take Zhawar finally. Now that's the DRA. As I said, the Soviets, at this point, 2,000 troops, as well as Soviet direct leadership in the field at this point. So take about a month. They're pulling together, and about February 28th, the combined DRA Soviet force leaves towards Zhawar, and they have to plow through snow for a month. The weather's terrible, so it's a slow go. So we don't see this force finally arrive to begin its attack until April 2nd, which is where things really start to kick off at this point. So you figure at this point, we're around 14,000 DRA Soviet troops directly involved in the initial second attack. Now, the Soviets, to your point, Ian, are not going to sit idly by. They're going to wait at the beginning of this second fight. They're going to assess how's the DRA command leadership doing, and they're not going to let it go off the rails completely at this point.
And Gorbachev's come to power in the year before. So how much is he looking at Afghanistan and considering his options there?
Absolutely. So as Gorbachev rose to power in 86, he really worked with the Afghan government. He wanted to get out of there. He saw it as a financial drain that they really couldn't afford at the time. It wasn't real popular back home by any means. So it was really a lose in his mind for what he saw. That whole endeavor has been for the Soviets, for Soviet troops, morale. So he was working out an agreement with the DRA that they would take more and more of that direct responsibility for their own security, for their own well-being, so he could have a plan to withdraw Soviet troops out completely. So more of that that ownership was being put back on the DRA, but the commanders, the Soviet commanders dealing more directly with the DRA are very concerned because they see the reality on the ground. Karmal is not a strong leader. He does not enjoy the will or support of the people. They basically only hold major cities, and that's really because of overwhelming military pressure on those cities as it is. So their fear is this guy is not capable to hold much, but Gorbachev wants to get out of there. And a lot of people have to keep in mind that some of the stated reasons that some believe that the Soviet Union did fall apart was the Soviet-Afghan war. From the financial drain, the popular support loss, the purpose behind it, why are we here? What good does that do us as the Soviet people? A confluence of events that, again, was a domino in many aspects as well that helped contribute to bringing down the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev, to his credit, saw a loose situation there as well. But there's also that kind of sense of national pride, right? Where you don't want to look like that you've been propping up this government and now you're running with your tail between your legs. So there's trying to balance all that from a world perspective, but also internally in Moscow and elsewhere. So it was a tough position from a leadership perspective, but he's committed. We have to get out of here. This isn't serving us at all.
You can always see parallels between Afghanistan and Vietnam. Are Gorbachev's generals saying, look, we can win this. We just need more. We just need more firepower. Is it a similar story there?
It's amazing how there are those similarities throughout history in many things, right? So he had generals that very much said, we can take these guys. I just need X, Y, and Z. But I guess I want to pause briefly because the Soviet military that went into Afghanistan was formulated around fighting a European war. They were not prepared in any form or fashion, both with a real strategic plan, but also equipment and training to fight what became a guerrilla war immediately. They were not equipped for that whatsoever, both in their choice of weapons that they had, but training and equipment, the uniforms that the Soviet troops wore. It was all just, as I think they say, it was a kind of a hot mess, as they say, right? So they had to learn trial by fire and try to adapt that fairly quickly. Within a year or so, I would say, really became obvious that, no, we've got to make some doctrinal changes here to try to have any chance of being effective. Now, that being said, there was still this, I call it the Soviet military mentality of overwhelming force at all times to just steamroll, right? So more tanks, more air power. We'll just bomb, shell, and then we'll just lay waste to everything. And that's really what their doctrine tried to evolve to. It's so if, the Mujahideen are throughout the land, then let's deprive them of the land. So they went about destroying villages, destroying crops. They went so far as to kill whole herds of animals that were used for food, because they thought if we take away all the food sources, then we'll just starve them into submission, and they'll have to. Obviously, that didn't work out, but that was very much part of their evolved strategy when they arrived there. So there are very much of those commanders that were in theater that thought they could still win that war. And to your point, the first thing that comes to mind, I think, with many is the Vietnam War, trying to win the hearts and minds, but deprive the enemy of its ability to move, of its ability to feed itself, to arm itself. In some context, we have relatable oranges to oranges here, as it were, from what the Soviets tried to achieve as well. Now, in regards to winning the hearts and minds, not so much. They were just more about trying to grind the opposition down till they were forced to submit through superior Soviet weaponry above all else. The DRA had proven it had failed in trying to win the hearts and minds, and it was only being propped up by Soviet arms.
So how does the Battle of Zhawar, the sequel, pan out? How does just describe the opening moves?
What's really interesting, so as we said, they left the combined DRA Soviet attack force, left on February 28th, 86. Took about a month grinding through. So they arrived in the Coast Valley, as it were, for their offensive on Zhawar. The Empire strikes back, as it were. Now, right off the bat are ominous signs of this might not go as smooth as we would like. So right off the bat, their initial assault began about April 2nd. Artillery barrage, pretty standard fare. But this was followed by airborne insertion from the 38th Commando Brigade via 6 Soviet transport helicopters. And this was in conjunction with the coordinated infantry attacks in the east and the west. So a coordinated, multi-pronged assault. But the airborne insertion was a disaster right off the bat, because they discovered about 3 a.m. that the paratroopers had missed their mark, and they actually ended up in Pakistan. So right off the bat, you missed your initial insertion of key troops that were key to the engagement. Those misdropped paratroopers are quickly captured by Pakistani forces, so can take them out of the play. But Azimi, the commander of the DRA, says, let's go forward still with the main assault. Even though their initial paratroopers were inserted wrong, he just went ahead and said, okay, let's use attack aircraft and transport helicopters and insert the remaining elements across 7 landing zones. So he's pushing forward. So the DRA commander said, okay, whoops, not a good start. Let's keep going. We got a big force. Let's make this happen. Launches the attack. So this infantry attack, though, was meant to link up the already destroyed air assault forces. So that's not good. So they already have problems. So we have landing zones. Infantry's has missed their mark. The attack is going forward, but you don't have your other partners to link up with. So we have a problem here. The landing zones become hot zones. This also reminded me a lot of Vietnam for the United States. Huey helicopter insertions, which I can speak to. My father was a 101st Airborne Infantry air assault guy. So he actually went in these helicopters, was dropped into combat zones. So these became attack points, both at Vietnam and in this battle. Mujahideen used these as attack points as well. So as they try to use these 7 drop zones, that's when the Mujahideen launched attacks to overrun a number of these. So they used dozens of fighters, and about 700 Mujahideen as a whole were in concealment during observing some of these drop zones and attacked these zones. And they actually overran 4 of these right off the bat, which resulted in over 500 commandos being captured, which is amazing right off the bat. So they're trying to use air power and drop zones. Mujahideen used the area, knew where they had to go in, right? because there's only so many locations. That's where the Mujahideen were using the terrain to their benefit, anticipating where the enemy would have to be. That's where they were at. So a disaster already. So the insertion's been bad. The attack was pressed, but it's already saw the result of hundreds of your troops captured already. So what does that mean? So we're talking days into this already. So three days in of combat, a poorly executed air insertion, troops captured in Pakistan, troops captured in the landing zone, still heavy fighting's occurring, right? But by this point, by day 3, the 38th Brigade is pretty much effectively destroyed from the DRA. And they've lost dozens of their transport helicopters in the assault as well. So it's at this point, the Soviets said, this is ridiculous. This is a disaster. So now they appoint General of the Army, Valentin Ivanovich Voronkov, to take charge, to turn things around. So he's put in charge of kind of salvaging what's going on so they can still achieve victory. So he takes some time. He brings in additional DRA regiments. He brings in DRA Spetsnaz, Special Forces. He brings in 6 Soviet battalions. So he bolsters up that force. So basically he was given 12 days by Soviet high command. Pull together what you need, develop a different strategy, assume command, and make this happen. So during those 12 days, he pulls together these additional forces. He uses Soviet DRA artillery and airstrikes, this time around the clock. He wants to keep it continuous, to wear the enemy down, to keep pummeling and pounding them. So what do we see? So we see April 17th is the next phase, this time Soviet-led. Artillery air units step up the intensity of what they're bombarding the Mujahideen with. This time, under the command of Soviet leadership, DRA infantry hits the Mujahideen 2 directions, the east and the west. Different staggered assaults, tactical adjustments were playing because it still was heavy resistance. But we were able to see DRA troops get to the high ground during the sustained attack, coordinated attack, which was more success than they had ever achieved otherwise. What was it? A key component at this point between the sustained attack was that we saw the Mujahideen actually withdraw from a strategic heights called Dwari Gar. This was a really important strategic part of the battlefield, a tactical part too, that was critical. So this is about the time in the Second Battle of Zhawar that things start to go right for the DRA and the Soviet force. And there's a couple parts. First, during that fight for Dwari Gar and neighboring cities, Lezi, a critical Mujahideen unit that was supposed to hold out up there inexplicably, and I still haven't been able to find why, withdrew without really engaging much with the attackers. That exposed that entire critically important area for the DRA and Soviets just to move into and occupy that. That's strategically was critical in the whole battle itself, but tactically horrible for the Mujahideen. Almost at the same time, during the airstrikes that are still occurring against positions, their commander Haqqani is wounded in an airstrike. Now that fog of war that is going to be so detrimental really played its part here, because word was incorrectly being sent around the Mujahideen defenders that Haqqani was actually killed. So psychologically, that was devastating because he was well loved by his fighters, well respected. So that falsehood was being spread quickly, word of mouth, and that was really destroying the morale of the Mujahideen defenders. And really, it served as an impetus for them to evacuate Zhawar itself. So those 2 things, again, really played in the part. And I want to reemphasize that because it was a quick sequence of events. The abandonment of Dwari Gar by Mujahideen defenders, inexplicably, with no orders, never really engaging in the fight itself by that unit, exposed and allowed DRA and Soviet forces to occupy that important high ground. And nearly at the same time, the Soviet bombardment that was occurring in the attack, it wounded the Mujahideen commander Haqqani, but it didn't kill him. But the fog of war got relayed down that Haqqani was killed, destroyed the morale, as it were, of the defenders of Zhawar who fought who then decided we need to evacuate Zhawar itself. Is at this point that with that evacuation order that was given to pull out, that those T-55s came out to serve as rear guard to kind of buy time so the defenders could get out and make their way to the mountains itself. But at the same time, keeping in mind that Zhawar was a critical supply and control hub, they basically left all their equipment in there. Supplies, all of that stuff was left. So months and months of defense was basically abandoned quickly during the second battle for Zhawar. And the DRA and Soviets would claim victory right around noontime, let's say April 19th, after all that blood, sweat, and toil on all parts, that they would claim victory there. But it wouldn't last too long, though.
And so by victory, because in the Soviet-Afghan war, there's countless incidents of both Afghan government forces and Soviet forces taking ground, but then being unable to hold it. So is that similar to what happens at Zhawar?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of resources and toil were fought over this critical area to deprive the enemy of it. And instead of solidifying gains militarily with an occupying force to maybe repurpose it to project power elsewhere, it was interesting because they were ordered to just destroy it, but they were only given 4 hours to destroy this key facility that had been a major pain in their side for years and a major hub of insurrectionists, let's say, kind of activity. So 4 hours is not nearly enough time to lay charges properly to destroy a facility of this size. And that's just what happened. So Soviet sappers did what they could within 4 hours. They used anti-tank mines at the cave entrances. They did what they could to try to destroy parts of it. But at the end of 4 hours, it was basically damaged, far from destroyed, far from putting it out of commission. And then when that was done, they pulled out. So the DRA and Soviets, after all that effort, two battles, hundreds and hundreds dead and captured on their part alone, let alone the other side, I would call it almost a Pyrrhic victory, because they went in, they suffered a lot of losses, they pushed twice, they captured the objective, but instead of occupying and seizing it and using it, as I said, as a base to maybe try to pacify the area, they're like, okay, good job, pat ourselves in the back, let's blow it up and get out. So really, it was almost pointless from a strategic point of view, because once they do what damage they can in those 4 hours and they pull back and go back to the major cities where their enclaves were, the Mujahideen just go back to the site and basically shore it up and just put it back in operational status within weeks. So really, it didn't serve anything strategically. Yes, it was considered a victory for the DRA Soviet forces. The second battle was, but it achieved nothing in the grand scheme of it. If anything, it was just a delaying action.
Incredible that happens. Were these battles studied by British and Americans when they went to Afghanistan?
They were always being studied. I know the CIA especially had a lot of CIA agents embedded with a lot of the Mujahideen, especially both for training with Stinger missile systems, but also seeing what were the tactics being used, as well as any defectors, because there were numerous defectors from the Soviet army that went to the Afghan side and to the West that were bringing information about tactics and strategy and what the equipment was. So it's interesting because if we fast forward from this event in 1986 and we go to 2001 plus from the American invasion of Afghanistan and occupation, and then NATO's involvement as well with their occupying force of roughly 20,000 at a given point. It's interesting because what happened in many aspects, like we occupied the major cities, right? We pacified those after initial invasion. That happened fairly quick. Built a military presence, and then we tried to send patrols and different projections of power, which the Soviets weren't so concerned with. But NATO and America tried to go out into the countryside. They tried to do the winning the hearts and minds, right? which is what we tried in Vietnam as well. But what's lost, I think, a lot is really understanding the history of Afghanistan, the different peoples of Afghanistan. It's got many thousands of years of history of a clan society, that your clan is more important than anybody coming outside to tell you how to believe, think, or respect. It's clan-based systems that have been around for thousands of years, from the Pashtun people, which is the dominant ethnic group, to all the various other tribes that are around. And it's trying to impose a system of governmental control from the Soviets. The British tried it. Everybody's tried it. But it's also, I think, in a lot of ways, losing sight of who are the people? What are they about? Just because it worked for a system of government in other countries doesn't mean it's going to work within the greater confines of Afghanistan. So it's really tribal based. And I think that continues to be lost in the mix of others trying to come in and impose a will that doesn't take hold. Maybe there's a reason why it doesn't take hold. It's been tried hundreds, if not thousands of years, others trying to impose a different system of governmental control that is antithetical to a lot of the people that are within the boundaries of what we know of Afghanistan.
And where do these two battles fit in as far as that 10-year history of the Afghan-Soviet war?
This is going to be towards the latter part of the war itself. So a lot of times the war is considered, the Soviet-Afghan war ended in about 89. So we're talking 86, late 86 fall. So this is one of the last major engagements of the war itself, especially from a Soviet perspective, where so many direct Soviet forces were involved directly in support of the DRA. So you can almost say this is one of the last gasps of a major military confrontation within the war itself.
So after this is really the start of the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Yeah, at this point, what you would see is a large Soviet commitment for this battle. And then per Gorbachev, he wanted to start pulling resources out. So we would start to see a downsizing, as it were, a withdrawal of more and more Soviet forces in chunks at that point. And I recall at the time seeing video of Soviet armored forces crossing over the bridge, leaving Afghanistan, and Soviets being very happy of it. It's embedded in my mind. I remember seeing that over and over. And as I researched this, it brought all that back again, just to see that as well. Yeah, it would be a downsizing at this point. We would start seeing the Soviets pull back more and more of their resources, a lot like what the United States did with Vietnam. As we were starting to pull things out and back, we would consolidate more and more to key areas or locations, still relying on air power right up until the end, because that's the easiest asset to pull out, which the Soviets did as well.
So, Michael, what would you see as the lessons here, aside from never try to invade Afghanistan?
Afghanistan's always going to be a complicated crossroads for the world itself. And I was alluding to this a minute ago. And the lessons learned are the lessons not learned, I would say, in many ways. I mentioned some of the different empires in the earlier that had given it a go at trying to rule over parts of Afghanistan or all of it, from Genghis Khan to the Timur Empire, the Mughals. The British fought 3 Anglo-Afghan wars over there, ostensibly to counter Russian Empire influence, but no lasting control there. The Russian Empire had forays early on as well, trying to fight what they called insurgents, but opposing viewpoints, trying to impose their will early on. It just has never worked out. And then we saw the United States in NATO, right? We saw that over 20 years withdrawal, and then how fast it collapsed back under the current control of the Taliban, who won the civil war in 92, as it was to assume control at that point after the Afghan war ended. So it's contentious. It's hard to see it not. So the lessons learned should be that it is a diverse group of people that necessarily don't want to be a cohesive federalized central governmental structure. Their identity is more important to them as to the tribe that they're a part of. That doesn't mean things can't evolve, but I just think what we see from what we saw the Soviets face, what we saw America face, Britain, all the great powers that have had any kind of foray in Afghanistan, even from the wisdom of Winston Churchill, as we saw. He saw it way back in 1897 that that's the reality of them. We have to be more objective about taking the reality of what's in front of us and what does that mean strategically. It's much easier to invade and take over a country first than it is to pacify it and have it be turned around to be a self-sustaining entity. And I think that's a lesson hard learned and not always learned well. And I don't think that'll probably change anytime soon, unfortunately.
The lessons of history are never learnt, are they? Certainly not on certainly don't appear to be on the military side anyway. But Michael, thank you so much for taking me through that. It's quite a labyrinthine conflict to explain. You did that very well. I will be adding various maps to the episode information. The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.